Chapter 10 is going to deal with the process of photosynthesis, and this is very complementary to cellular respiration. We're going to see actually a lot of things that happen in cellular respiration are going to happen kind of the opposite in photosynthesis. So this process is going to take sunlight and carbon and turn that into sugars. So who can do photosynthesis? Anybody who has a chloroplast. So this is typically going to be plants and then other photosynthetic organelle, things like algae and some other protists. Photosynthesis is all about converting energy. Just like with cellular respiration, in cellular respiration we converted energy from chemical energy in sugar into usable energy in ATP. So we're going to take a step back and we're going to convert solar energy from the sun into chemical energy. And this is going to be in the form of carbon compounds, typically sugars. Photosynthesis provides nourishment for the entire living world. So it does this directly for autotrophs. So auto means self, and troph is referring to feeding. So an autotroph is a self-feeder. This organism is going to be able to sustain themselves without having to actually consume anything. They can take the energy from the sun in photosynthesis and turn it into sugar, and then they can take the energy from the sugar in a mitochondria and turn it into ATP. An indirect application of photosynthesis is the heterotrophs. So hetero means different, and then again, troph is feeding. So this is you and me, where we obtain organic material from other organisms. So because we can't do photosynthesis, we can't make our own sugars. However, we can eat them from other materials. So you either eat plants or you eat animals that ate plants at some point. And so all of the energy that you consume ultimately came from a plant that gained energy from the sun. So a chloroplast is the organelle where photosynthesis is going to occur, and these happen in what's called the mesophyll tissue of the leaf. So you can see the mesophyll is this big bracket. This is a cross-section of a leaf, so this would be the top of the leaf and the bottom of the leaf, and it's basically like you took a hole punch and we're looking into the side of the leaf here. So you can see there's two different regions of mesophyll. There's this palisade mesophyll near the top, and a spongy mesophyll near the bottom, and the difference is really just how tightly packed the cells are at the top versus kind of loosely packed they are at the bottom. And you can see inside of these cells they have little green organelles kind of surrounding the outside edges, and those are all of the chloroplasts that are going to actually be doing the mechanism of photosynthesis. The guard cells at the bottom that surround the stoma also have chloroplasts, so the guard cells are typically also green and able to do photosynthesis. The gases that we use for photosynthesis are going to enter the leaf through these pores called stomata. So stomata is plural for there are multiple stomata. Stoma is singular, so there is one stoma in this picture. The word stoma actually means mouth. So these are openings where carbon dioxide is going to be able to come into the plant, and then when it releases oxygen, it's going to be able to leave through those stoma. And we can actually regulate how much of these gases can come in or leave with the guard cells that are able to either open or close the stomata. So if we zoom in even closer and look at a single chloroplast, hopefully this looks a little familiar from when we looked at the organelles. So a chloroplast has a double membrane, so we have an outer and an inner membrane, which was one of the clues that this evolved by endosymbiosis. Inside of the inner membrane, inside of here, we have a dense liquid called the stroma, S-T-R-O-M-A, not to be confused with the stoma. Remember, stoma is the mouth, right? That's the opening on the bottom of the leaf. The stroma is a liquid inside of the chlorophyll. Definitely make some flashcards, make sure you don't get those mixed up. Inside of this liquid, we have this green membrane here called the thylakoid. And this is actually one giant continuous membrane that is highly stacked on top of itself. So each little disc, I think that these look kind of like the Girl Scout cookies, Thin Mints, if Thin Mint cookies were green. So each of these little cookies is a thylakoid, and an entire sheaf or stack of cookies is called a granum, or grana. Granum is singular, grana is plural. Within the thylakoid membrane is the pigment called chlorophyll, and this is what gives the cell its green color. So this is a green pigment, and it is inside of the thylakoid membrane. And if you look at the thylakoid membrane, you can see that it's highly folded into discs that are stacked on top of itself. And just like the cristae in the mitochondria, the reason that these inner membranes are highly folded is because this is where something is going to be happening. And specifically, this is where the light reactions happen. And we're going to need a huge amount of surface area to provide lots of surface to do the light reactions of photosynthesis. So let's take a moment and look at the equation for photosynthesis. And what I hope you'll notice is that it is the exact opposite of the equation for cellular respiration. So this is a fully balanced equation. We've got carbon dioxide as a reactant, as well as water. If you remember cellular respiration, these were both waste products. The cellular respiration made energy in the form of ATP. In the case of photosynthesis, we're going to use energy, but in the form of light energy. So those are my reactants. If you're a plant and you want to survive, you need carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you need water from the soil, and you need light from the sun. As a product, we're going to be able to produce sugar. So this is our organic component. This is the goal of photosynthesis. This is glucose. And then we're going to produce oxygen as a waste product. The process does also create a little bit of water. You actually put more water into it than you get out of it, so we don't usually consider this one. It's just added here because this is a balanced equation. When we first started studying photosynthesis, we actually thought that the oxygen originally came from the carbon dioxide because they were both gases. So what we assumed was that the carbon dioxide was pulled off of the oxygen and then the oxygen was just released. And after experiments using sulfur instead of oxygen, what we found out is that the carbon dioxide actually is converted into glucose. So you can see here the color coding showing how the carbon dioxide reactant is for the most part going to end up in the glucose product. And this process here is mostly going to happen in the second stage of photosynthesis called the Calvin cycle. What we did see when we used sulfur instead of oxygen in the reaction was that we ended up with S2. So we know that the oxygen waste product actually comes from the water molecule. And this is going to be the very first step that happens in the light reactions, which are the very first process in photosynthesis. So this is very much a backwards rendition of the cellular respiration equation. So the reactants of one equation are the products of the other, and vice versa. In cellular respiration, the very last thing that happened was water being formed after oxygen accepted an electron. In this case, the very first thing we're going to do is break water into hydrogen and oxygen. Just like cellular respiration, photosynthesis is a redox reaction. We are going to see another electron transport chain. So we're going to see reduction and oxidation as electrons are passed from one molecule to the other. And so we can see how carbon dioxide, which has a polar bond with oxygen, where the electrons are going to be stored very close to oxygen, is going to change into carbon sharing with hydrogen, which is going to be a non-polar bond. So the carbon is going to be reduced. So the carbon goes from having less than half of the access to the electrons to having pretty much equal access of electrons. So in that sense, it is gaining electrons and thus reduced. We also know that the water becomes oxygen. So in the water, we see oxygen sharing with hydrogen. This is a polar bond where the oxygen has more access to the electrons. And then eventually oxygen is going to be sharing with itself, which is again a non-polar bond, where the electrons are going to be shared much more evenly. So the oxygen is going to go from having full access here to the electrons. It's essentially going to lose some access to the electrons because it's now going to have to share equally, and so it's going to become oxidized. And this is again the exact opposite of what happens in the cellular respiration equation. Photosynthesis happens in two stages. The first stage is the light reactions, and then the second stage is the Calvin cycle. The light reactions obviously need light, so we can actually take reactants and the products of the photosynthesis equation and we can split them into the two stages. You need to know which ones belong in which area. So the reactants that we need for the light reaction is going to be light. We're going to be putting energy in. We also need water to do the light reactions. So without light, without water, the light reactions are not going to go. There are some reactants that are cycled between the two cycles, so they don't make it into the overall equation. We need some energy storing molecules. So just like in cellular respiration, we had NAD+. In photosynthesis, we have NADP+. I like to think that it's got an extra P here for photosynthesis. It's a phosphate, but it helps for remembering. And then we're also going to have ADP, which we're going to end up transforming into ATP in an electron transport chain. So those are all of the reactants for the light reaction. And eventually the products we're going to produce are oxygen, which is a waste gas that results from splitting water molecules. And we're going to make some energy. We're going to create some ATP and an energy storing molecule, NADPH. And NADPH you can think is almost exactly the same thing as NADH, except it's got a P in it for photosynthesis. These energy molecules are then going to be the energy that are used to power the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle does not require any light. The Calvin cycle can actually happen at night in the dark, hidden in a closet. So the reactants for the Calvin cycle are carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH. Carbon dioxide is our organic molecule. That's where we're going to be pulling carbon from. And then ATP and NADPH are the power source that are going to drive this reaction. So as the reaction occurs, we're going to get a organic sugar out of it. So C6H12O6, that's my glucose. That's the product we have been waiting for the whole process. And then as we use the energy, we're also going to produce ADP and NADP+, which will just then be recycled back to the light reaction. So these energy molecules don't typically make it into the overall equation because they're recycled between one reaction and the next. So before we can understand how the light reaction works, we need to understand a little bit about light. Light is an electromagnetic wave. And here you can see the entire electromagnetic spectrum, which is the entire range of electromagnetic energy or electromagnetic radiation. So electromagnetic energy is going to travel in waves like this. And the wavelength is the distance from a crest to a crest. So that is the wavelength. We can also measure the trough to a trough. That's the same thing. So you can see those wavelengths are actually going to be the same either way it's measured. So this is the wavelength. Visible light is only a small portion of wavelengths on the electromagnetic spectrum. So visible light is the light that you can see, and that's going to appear in the colors that you are familiar with of the rainbow. So we've got red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, which is backwards here for Roy G. Biv, if that's how you learned it. And so violet has the shortest wavelength at 380 nanometers, and then red has the largest wavelength at 750 nanometers. You do not have to memorize these wavelengths. If you need to answer a question about wavelengths, you're always going to be given a graph or the numbers that you need. So again, you don't have to memorize these. At this end of the spectrum, we have a shorter wavelength. That number is smaller, so these waves are going to be closer together. And that produces higher energy. So those waves are going to typically be high in energy. At this end of the spectrum, we're going to have a lower wavelength, which means that the waves are going to be further apart, and those are going to have a lower energy. You probably also recognize some of the other types of light up here. So we have UV or ultraviolet light, so like a black light. X-rays, so those are what we use to see your skeleton. And then gamma rays, which are what turn Bruce Banner into the Hulk, except that's not real. And all of those are going to have even shorter and shorter wavelengths, and thus even higher and higher energy. On the other end of the spectrum, we have infrared or IR. We use these for night vision goggles for sensing heat. Some snakes can actually use IR sensor to sense warm-bodied mammals. Microwaves, and then the largest waves are radio waves. These are what are going to transmit music. So this is going to be on the scale of thousands of meters. And again, these are going to have larger wavelengths, which means that the troughs are further apart, and thus they have less energy. Light is a very interesting thing. As it is a wave, it is also going to behave in a discrete particle called a photon. The photon contains a specific amount of energy. So the longer the wavelength, the lower the energy contained in the photon. The shorter the wavelength, the larger the amount of energy contained in a photon. So how do we actually see light? The color that you see is what gets reflected back at you. Look at your shirt or look at something around you that's brightly colored. Inside of the coloration, you have pigments. The pigment is what gives your shirt that color, right? So if I'm going to dye a shirt blue, I use a blue dye pigment. If I want to put makeup on my face, you can actually buy makeup pigment, and that's the color of the makeup that's going to go on your face. The pigment is going to absorb all of the light that you don't see. The color that you see is what gets reflected back at you or transmitted through without being absorbed. So if it is not absorbed, it gets reflected, meaning that it bounces off, or transmitted, just meaning that it goes through. These are the ones that you can see. So leaves are green. Leaves are green because the pigment, chlorophyll, does not absorb green. The green light that hits the pigment from the sun actually gets bounced off, it gets reflected, or it gets transmitted through the entire pigment. And then that light reaches your eyes, and what you see is green. I would expect for plants to grow better in light that's red or blue. And if I gave a plant just a green light to grow, it would probably not grow very well because they're not very good at absorbing green light. The sun emits the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So the sunlight has all of the different colors of light for plants to absorb. The way that we measure how light is absorbed is through a photospectrometer. So photo means light, meter means measure, and spectro is just the method of kind of beaming light through a liquid. So we use a tool called a photospectrometer, and we can use this to send light through a pigment, and it will measure the light that gets transmitted. So that's the light that is not absorbed. If we know what was not absorbed, then we know what was absorbed, which is just everything else. And we can graph what's called an absorption spectrum. So on the y-axis here, we have absorption. So over here, we would have something that is absorbed. And at the bottom, we would have something that is reflected or transmitted. So a really low value here means that the plant is not gaining very much energy from that, whereas a really high value here means that the plant is gaining a lot of energy from that. And then down here we have the visible light spectrum, so we have violet all the way to red. And you can see the colors change. Plants actually have multiple different pigments. So we have chlorophyll A, there's another one, chlorophyll B, and then there's a whole group of accessory pigments, one of which is called carotenoids, which looks a little bit like the word carrot, which is true because carrots have carotenoids. So let's look at the absorption spectrum for chlorophyll A. So chlorophyll A has a peak right here. The highest absorption for chlorophyll A is right here. That's going to be, let's see, that's 450. This is about 430 nanometers, which is a purplish, bluish color. Chlorophyll A drops off by the time it reaches most of blue. So it's going to mostly be reflecting the blue light, it's reflecting green light, it's reflecting yellow light. And then again here we're going to pick up and have another absorption peak at about 680 nanometers. A plant with the chlorophyll A pigment is going to absorb purple and orange and red light really well, but it's going to reflect blue, green, and yellow light, which actually gives chlorophyll A this kind of bluish green color. So you can see that the line is colored blue and green because that's the color of the pigment. Let's look at chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll B has a absorption peak here at about 450. So this is a more bluish purple light. So it can absorb purple, but it absorbs blue really well. And it absorbs all the way through the blue spectrum and then drops off here at green. Chlorophyll B is really low for yellow, and then it has another peak here at about 640. So chlorophyll B is going to absorb purple and blue. It's going to reflect yellow and green, and then absorb orange and a little bit of red. So a chlorophyll B pigment actually looks yellowish green because it reflects more just green and yellow, and it actually absorbs blue. Carotenoids are a type of accessory pigment. You'll notice that they have peaks here in the blue, green, and purple, and then they drop off and don't absorb yellow, orange, or red. And so the carotenoid pigments are reflecting yellow, orange, and red, which is going to give you a orangish color, which is why carrots are orange. But a plant doesn't have just one type of pigment. Plants have all of these pigments. They typically have chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids, and that helps to broaden the spectrum for photosynthesis. If I have a pigment that can absorb purple, another pigment that absorbs blue, and then another pigment that can absorb a little bit of green, that's going to be helpful. That means that I can absorb some of all of the different colors of the spectrum. So an action spectrum is actually going to measure the rate of photosynthesis. So at the top here, photosynthesis will go fast. At this down here, photosynthesis would go slow. And then again, on the X, we have the electromagnetic spectrum in nanometers. So assume that this plant has chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids. And so because it has all three, it actually has the fastest peaks of photosynthesis in this kind of purple-blue light. And then there's another photosynthesis peak over here in orange and red light. And this is just an additive effect of all of the absorption spectrums added up. Notice here, if I gave this plant just green light, it probably wouldn't grow very well, but it might not die. It can actually absorb some green light. And the reason it can absorb some green light is because it's got the accessory pigments, like the carotenoids, which we're able to absorb into the green light spectrum. The photosynthesis rate is going to be pretty slow, so this plant might grow pretty slow, but it might still grow. There's a whole suite of accessory pigments. Often we call them carotenoids. There are flavonoids, carotenoids, anthocyanins, and they absorb at different wavelengths. So you can see that the flavonoids are going to absorb everything except yellow. The carotenoids reflect that orangish color. And the anthocyanins are going to reflect red, which means that they're absorbing the other colors. So when a leaf has all of these colors together, it's going to be able to have a wider range of function. A lot of the times we think that these accessory pigments are there to protect the leaf in a function called photoprotection. So this literally just means light protection. And basically what this means is that if the chlorophyll can't absorb a certain light, that these carotenoids are going to be able to absorb it, and then that light can't damage the plant. We know that solar energy damages living things, right? If you spend too much time in the sun without sunscreen, you can get skin cancer. Well, plants are not immune to the damaging effects of solar energy either. They just can absorb it. So if they have pigments that can absorb the entire spectrum of light, they're not going to get as damaged. This is also why leaves turn color in the fall. So not so much in Florida, but if you've ever lived in the Northeast or seen plants where their leaves change color and then they fall off, what happens in the fall is that the chlorophyll actually breaks down. And then what's left are the accessory pigments. So we see these beautiful fall colors, the orange and the yellow and the red, and those leaves are still able to do photosynthesis. They're just using a different spectrum of light as their main source. And then eventually the leaves get completely fallen off and the plants cease doing photosynthesis until the spring.